wanted to go over the exercise first, so shall we tape that, or? We can, I guess. Well, I guess, so I actually only solved exercise 1.1b because I thought that would be the hardest one. So the other ones were fine, I presume, I assume. I hope so. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I could just as well, you know. I can reuse them. Okay, so, well, in that homework, it was about Bayesian inference in the normal distribution, where there was basically a normal prior on the mean that looked like that, where you had, so let me just quickly write down the normal distribution that we're actually putting that prior on, because it's not on the slide. We have the normal distribution, well, some x, and it has the mean mu, and, well, the variance equal to 1 over tau. Right? So this is tau is the precision. Tau is like this. So, well, we said that the mean has a normal prior which has some prior mean and a prior variance over the precision of the likelihood. And the, well, tau has a gamma prior with some parameters.
Should that be, the left-hand side, should it be alpha not beta not instead of just alpha beta? When you have alpha and beta there, should they be alpha not beta not, or where are they?
What do you mean by alpha not beta not?
Zero? Instead of alpha and beta.
Oh, whether it should be alpha beta or alpha not beta not?
Right.
Well, I just call them alpha not beta not because they are kind of my prior.
I just mean like the way they're written.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah. So here there should also be zeros. Yeah. So the idea is that the prior before seeing any data is basically this. This is the sample size of the posterior, right?
Why do you have tau in the prior for mu?
Huh?
I mean, why do you have S0 squared divided by tau?
Well, that is just what we need in order for the prior to be conjugate. That was exactly that.
Why is tau? Why is this prior dependent on tau? I thought that mu and tau are independent.
That was the idea, but it worked out that you cannot. I mean, that it is not conjugate if you do that.
Okay.
So you need that. That was actually exactly the correction to the exercise sheet that I was handing out last time. So this is just writing out those two distributions. So this is here the normal distribution. This is the gamma distribution. And, well, then we can just write them such that everything that, well, does depend on tau or on mu is on the right side, and everything else is here. Right? So this is how we start. So this is just the same thing as before. This is the posterior. So now in addition, we also have the likelihood. So the likelihood is just the product over n Gaussians and Gaussian over each data point. So that is that. And well, now we just call everything that doesn't depend on the parameter as a constant, because we know that the posterior will look like the prior, so we don't have to worry about constants. Actually, the whole thing is still what I wrote before, was also just proportional to the posterior, because we did not write down the marginal likelihood, so the normalization constant. So we have some parts that, so here I also did the squares, so we have kind of this sum over the squares in y. That depends on tau. Then I have something that depends on mu squared and tau. So that's kind of how I have to separate out those parameters, because I want a distribution over tau and mu. So I have terms that are linear in tau. Then I have a term that is quadratic in mu and linear in tau, and then I have something that is linear in both in the exp. So the product of all these exp is just the sum, right? Of basically, it's a sum of in a single exponential function. And well, so one thing that I realize here is that I can just read off Sn, which is just 1 over that. And the reason for that is that I need that my prior distribution over mu looks like this. So I have something that is linear in tau and quadratic in mu, right? Here, from that square. So that is just completing. I'm just now completing that square for the posterior. So I've got something that is, if I write down this, I have mu square minus 2m0 mu plus m0 square. And I know that everything that is multiplied by mu square is now like inversely proportional to S posterior, right? Just because there's no other mu square in the prior. So I can just take these mu squares here and here, combine them, and then I know that, well, because I have tau over twice the variance, I know that this time, this stuff here must be 1 over the variance. Is that clear? Okay. Doesn't seem to be clear.
Sorry, where does the tau go?
Well,
mu squared.
well, if I look at the, I mean, this here is the prior over over mu, right?
Yeah.
And the prior over mu has a tau in there.
Yeah.
And the tau will be again there, right?
Yeah, but but when you're reading off Sn,
Yeah.
there's no tau.
Yes, because I mean, basically, what I want to bring it in the form that looks like this.
Yeah.
That looks like the prior, because I know that the posterior will look exactly like the prior. So I need something that is tau over 2 times the variance. So it's tau over 2 times the variance.
Okay. You want it to look like the prior, not necessarily.
I want it to look exactly like the prior, because I know it's conjugate, so it has to look like the prior. That's the whole trick. So I can read that part off. The other thing that I can read off is basically alpha n, because the only place where alpha appears is in the exponent of tau in the prior. So that part is the prior, right? So the only alpha that I see is here. So in order to bring the posterior into the same form as the prior, I can just look at everything that is tau, that is basically a power of tau, right? I've got a power of tau here, and that is the power of tau. And I know it has to be alpha 0 minus 1/2, so it has to be alpha n minus 1/2 in the end. So I have to subtract off 1/2 from that, which is that here, so it's n/2 over plus alpha 0. I've already solved these two just by reading them off, just by looking at the posterior and seeing, well, just bringing them in the same form as the prior.
Isn't it supposed to be tau to the alpha minus 1? Did I miss something?
Where is that tau to the alpha minus 1? It's tau to the...
That's the gamma distribution, right? It's supposed to have alpha to it.
Oh, the 1/2 comes from also putting in the, so there's also the Gaussian on the mean where tau appears.
Okay.
So it's basically in the, if I go back, see, I've got a tau to the alpha minus 1 from the gamma, alpha 0 minus 1, but I also have a tau here, which is basically a tau to the power, I mean, it's here it's tau to the minus 1, so it's tau to the plus 1/2. And if I just multiply these two, I have got tau to the alpha 0 minus 1/2.
Yeah, but aren't you trying to make it, like, trying to fit it to a gamma distribution?
I want to fit it to the Gauss gamma. So it's, as I said, they're not two independent distributions anymore. I mean, I can always pull out the 1/2 if I want.
I see.
Later. Okay. So I just combined these two things. And that gives me the 1/2 here. So I've read off these two now. Well, now comes the completing the squares part, because I already know from that square here what's the inner part. So basically what's the constant that I'm multiplying with, which is the, well, I've got this square here. I already know Sn, and I already know, well, mu, and got something that is now linear in M0 times mu. So it's something that is linear in M0 times well, something that is linear in mu. That is here. It's linear in mu and linear in tau. It's this part. So I know that this here is what I have to take to complete the square. I have to bring it to the form where it's basically mu times tau. Well, I've got, if I multiply these out, I get 2 times mu times m0 in the square. So it's a mu square minus 2 times mu times m0 plus m0 square. Right, that's just the square over tau times tau 2 times the variance. So I already know times tau 2 times the variance is that part. Now I know that the remaining of this has to be equated to, so this has to be equated to that. So I take that part here, I divide it by the variance, I multiply it by the variance, so that just cancels. And now I can just do this division, and I know that mn is that. Or I can simplify a little bit more. So this part here has to be mn. I will hand these out so you can look over it again. I mean, but the important bit is to understand the steps that you have to do. You always look for something that has the right functional form. It has kind of the right exponent in the parameter that you're interested in, or in the parameter that you're evaluating in. So you have to look for something that is, for example, quadratic in mu and linear in tau, and then you know in the prior where all the terms that are quadratic in mu and linear in tau appear, and then just figure out the rest. So that's then just some equations. Then you can always plug these in and try to solve the next one. So now we already have Sn, alpha n, and Mn. And all with these forms here, and now we can plug them in. And now everything looks already much simpler. Now what's missing is, we also know alpha n. So what's still missing is which part is missing? Beta n.
Wish we had the brain out.
Yeah. Okay, so it's just the same thing, just reordering a bit, and then we solve for beta n. I mean, it's just mechanics from there, because we know that beta n appears in the prior. If you look back at the prior. Beta appears to the power of alpha, and it also appears here in the exponent beta 0 times tau. So in this case, we solve by finding the only term that is linear in tau here. So here, here's a tau, there's a tau. Now we basically factor out the tau because everything is now kind of linear in tau. So so everything that is linear in tau together, this part has to be beta n.
What about the other exponential? Oh wait, never mind. Sorry.
I mean, I hope there are no typos, but oh yeah, the other exponential, there's also that is not just linear in tau, but it's also linear in tau, and there's also mu. There is no mu, so this part is just the posterior over mu. So there's also, we know that also there is a tau. So everything that is where mu and tau appear, so something that is quadratic in mu and tau has to belong to the posterior over the mean, and the rest is this minus tau times something that does not contain mu has to be beta n, and then it just comes out like that. So who figured this out? Nobody. So yeah, so it's not that easy. But it's just mechanics. So it's I mean, doesn't. Yeah.
Do we need to figure out the marginal likelihood also? Because this is only proportional to the sphere. Right?
Yes, but we know that it has the form of a Gaussian gamma. So if we now basically take the prior again. So that's the nice thing about conjugate priors. And now we just replace all these M0, S0, alpha 0, and beta 0 with Mn, Sn, alpha n, and beta n, then we get the posterior. Because we know it has the same functional form. We know that this is a normalized distribution. We're done. So we just get updates to the parameters.
Yeah.
This is kind of also this idea of sequential learning. The marginal likelihood is not 1 by definition. It's just, we can just all pull it into the constant because we know that, I mean, we know that the prior that we started with was normalized. Well, once we multiplied in the likelihood, it was not normalized anymore. But we could normalize by multiplying it to a constant. But we know that the posterior has the same functional form as the prior. So if we just figure out the updated parameters, then we can just plug in these updated parameters into the prior, and we've got the posterior. This is the whole beauty of these conjugate priors. So we don't, I mean, figuring out that normalization constant is tough, but we don't need to do it. because we chose everything conjugate.
We've done, you can do 1.2 just as like a sanity check. Okay.
1.2?
Yeah, the second one, just as like sanity check to see if. Make sure we did it right. Just make sure we're doing it right. Yeah, we're not like doing things.
1.1 or?
It's the one with the binomial.
Oh yeah, okay, so yeah, we can, maybe someone wants to do it at the board, and we can just, yeah, yes.
I can do it.
Okay, perfect.
But I will be-
We need, yeah, maybe we're all there to help. No pressure.
Help me out so much when I'm
I'll even clean the board for you. Yeah.
like,
I mean, this was the exercise that I assumed that people might have trouble with, but it's a good. It's good to have some exercises with that.
exercise was just difficult because you didn't really know exactly what was happening. But once we got that, it was pretty easy. I think.
Okay, so
Alright, so we just talked.
just that we know the.
The binomial K theta and
I'll actually put you here.
oh, wow, that's it. Mr. Teacher Man. Excellent. Okay, so the binomial is n choose k times theta to the k times 1 minus theta to the n minus k, right? Good. Beta distribution. Given alpha and beta is that thing, so theta to the alpha minus 1, 1 minus theta to the beta minus 1 over the beta function of alpha and beta. Actually, let's make this. The beta function is just it's basically this thing, except you just take the integral from 0 to 1 with respect to theta. So anyway, so the whole thing ends up being, so if you're looking for the probability of theta given k and n, it's going to be proportional to probability of k given n theta, probability of theta. And so this one is going to be distributed with the beta, yeah? That's the beta distribution, and this one's going to be binomial. So this just ends up being n choose k, theta to the k, 1 minus theta to the n minus k, theta to the alpha minus 1, 1 minus theta to the beta minus 1, over this thing, which is an integral which you don't have to worry about anyway in the end, because it just ends up being a constant. So we just combine these two terms and these two terms right here, and we get n choose k, theta to the alpha plus k minus 1, 1 minus theta to the beta plus n minus k minus 1. So we know alpha prime is going to be alpha plus k, and beta prime is beta plus n minus k. Yeah.
Right.
Cool.
So what's the, you have the kind of interpretation now for these new updated parameters?
Mhm.
So what does it tell you? I mean, what's the influence of the prior? What's the posterior? So,
Well, not exactly sure what the beta distribution is. So.
Okay, so, well, I mean here, I mean if you view it kind of as a, just let's look at it as a prior for the binomial and how they influence the binomial. You see that alpha gets updated to alpha plus k and beta to beta plus n minus k. So basically the number of
failures
heads
goes
into alpha and the number of failures goes into beta.
Yeah.
Then we see that kind of that alpha and beta are kind of like a prior counts for failures and successes in the experiment. So this is, and a lot of these conjugate priors can be interpreted in such a way. We also saw that for the mean of the Gaussian, where kind of the prior mean was weighted in for some extent by the prior variance, and that also and then scaled kind of inversely to the size of the data.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like prior data usually.
Cool.
Thanks for that.
Thank you.
I assume 1-1 is not important because it was basically entailed in the other one, right?
I have a question. Do we know beforehand that we're going to use that the binomial is the conjugate prior and the posteriors can also be binomial? Or is it as a result of doing this algebra that we figured that out?
Well, we know it beforehand because we've chosen it to be a conjugate. So that's just something that, yeah, I mean, they are just these pairs of conjugate distributions, and one just has to know what is conjugate to what. I don't know whether there's an easy way to find out. I would assume that if I think of these things as prior counts, then probably if you integrate over the parameter over a uniform distribution and solve the integral, then maybe you get the conjugate prior. I could imagine that, but I don't know. So that is now off the record. Okay, so. So let's move on. So I'll quickly, as always, repeat what we've done, the new that we've done last time. Before I'll, so that was linear regression and maximum likelihood estimation on that. I won't talk so much about the genome-wide association studies, but just wanted to repeat those maximum likelihood solutions here. Then, well, I mean, in this example that I last time showed, I kind of said, oh yeah, I mean, it looks like those parameters that we estimated look Gaussian. So, well, let's learn a little bit more theory about the Gaussian. Maybe it tells us more about the distribution that we would expect. And then we'll use that to like formally discuss hypothesis testing. And I don't know whether I will get to this today or next week. Multiple hypothesis testing. So, well, I mean, you see the slide now for the third time. Well, you have a data set where we model a function from x to y, which depends on parameters, and there's noise. Then we choose a distribution for the noise, which is Gaussian. It's a model choice. The reality doesn't have to look like that. So in this case, it's just kind of just formulate everything that we know, kind of how the data is generated, and if you think that it's some influence plus Gaussian noise, then we write that. And if that influence, this function looks Gaussian, looks linear, then we use a linear regression. So basically, this is now the f of x. If it's linear, it's just the inner product of the parameters beta times the x's. And well, we also said that we can ignore the c here in the math just to save some writing, just by appending it to X. And that's the equivalent graphical model. Again, variables are circles here. Then some circles only appear once, and some are replicated in these plates the number of times that it's written on the plate. Yeah, in order to solve for these parameters, that should be a beta. I'm always finding more typos. I already fixed that one. That was also a theta last time. Now I even managed to make the slide inconsistent. In order to solve that, we basically write down the likelihood, and well, if we take the log likelihood, then we see that the only part that depends on the parameters is the sum of squares of the differences between the y's and this regression function. So, well, now we've found least squares estimation, which looks like that. So we find a regression function that has the smallest squared difference, and the regression function is linear. Well, we said, okay, how do we solve it? We take the derivative with respect to a single entry beta I. So this is now a vector. If we take the derivative with a single entry, then basically we get the 2 times that. So the 2 goes away here. Then then we have to take the derivative of the inner, which is the sth entry of xn. So it's that part, because this inner product is just a sum over s. So in order to take the derivative over the s in the sum, all the other terms don't matter, so we are only left with the s term. And then we introduce the idea of a gradient. So the gradient is just the vector holding all the derivatives for every s. And this gradient, well, looks like that. So basically it's just taking that, and instead of just taking that sth entry, it's now appending all of these. And now the 0 is not it's not just one value, it's a vector of zeros that has the same size as the gradient. Well, if you want to solve that, well, it's just rewriting the same thing, basically taking that sum, and instead of writing the sum over the vectors, we can also write it as a matrix product in this matrix, where you just take all the n x vectors and put them together in a matrix. So now it's a matrix vector product, so because that is also a vector, so it's a matrix vector product here. And if you want to solve for that, then, well, we first have to find something that if we multiply it to x, the x goes away. And we said that we can do that by doing using the pseudo-inverse. So basically, if we we have x transpose y minus x transpose x beta. We can put the x transpose x beta on the right side. If we multiply x transpose x by its inverse, we get just beta on the right side. So on the right side, it's not just beta. On the left side, we have x transpose x inverse x transpose y. And we call that part the pseudo-inverse of x. Okay, so an application is genome-wide association studies, where we find these associations between SNPs and phenotypes using linear regression. Well, some definitions. So the genotype, as I said, is the genetic state of an individual. The phenotype is the state of the trait, and a locus is a particular region on the genome, usually marked by a single SNP. So sometimes call a SNP also locus, which is a little bit an abuse of these terms. And an allele is the genetic state of a locus. Well, we said there are haploid and diploid organisms, where haploid organisms are basically, so if you, basically all the chromosomes are identical, or there's only one chromosome, like inbred lab strains or sperm cells that actually only have a single chromosome set. Or there are diploid organisms, so those are the most common ones, like humans, where we have two different chromosome sets, one from the father, one from the mother. And, well, there's also other stuff, like something that has more than two chromosomes and so on. Well, the haplotype is the state of a single set of chromosomes, so it's either the paternal or the maternal set. Like there's heterozygous and homozygous. Okay, so if you have two different chromosomes, then every locus can either be different, then we call it heterozygous, or it can be the same, then we call it homozygous. And then we also said that usually we speak of a major and a minor allele, where the major allele is the reference, so that's the non-mutated state, and the minor allele is this kind of the mutation. And, well, what we do is in this encoding is we just count the number of mutations. So we get a number of between 0 and 2. And we do that for every SNP. And, well, we use a linear regression, where basically the phenotype is now modeled as a linear function in the SNP times beta and noise. And we did that in Arabidopsis, which is just a model planned. Yeah.
I have a question. So, I mean, in this model, you basically fit one linear regression for every SNP, right?
Yes.
So why don't we? I mean, like, would it be different or better to fit one big regression for all SNPs, with all SNPs considered as features, and how would that?
Yes, that's something that we'll see later. That if we do that by maximum likelihood, this will run into problems. So basically, there are usually more SNPs than people. So, well, I mean, in order to solve that, we have to find a least squares solution. And in this case, it's so we prefer an over-constrained problem to an under-constrained problem because.
Well, what would happen if you regularize them? I mean, you can do well to.
Yes, I mean, you can do regularization. I mean, and that's something that we'll discuss later. But using maximum likelihood, that is a bad idea. Yeah, right. So, there's also the last time there was the question whether always the conjugate prior is a good prior, and that is very related to what you just said. And so the conjugate, I can already tell you the conjugate prior for the linear regression, it's just the mean of a Gaussian basically, will also be a Gaussian on the regression weights. And if we do that, then basically the Gaussian, we always penalize kind of the squared deviation from the mean, right? Which, I mean, if you look at the squares, then this penalty kind of goes like a parabola, right? Which means that so this is the mean here. So if you're at the mean, this parabola basically is 0. So, I mean, this penalty is very close to 0. So you're really allowed to move pretty freely here, right? But as soon as you go out very far, then this penalty, well, it grows quadratically. So so if you have just a deviation like this, this deviation here, you already have this penalty. Whereas if you have some deviation here, you almost have 0 penalty. So if the result is that all our effects will kind of be in this regime. So we'll have pretty much everything on. Everything will not be equal to the mean, but just fluctuate a little bit around the mean. But we'll have observed very few things that move far away from the mean. And for example, in such a genome-wide association study, we would assume that, well, that is probably not the model that corresponds to the way the data works. I mean, we would think that most of the mutations actually have very small influence, and a couple have a larger influence. And that for that reason, we don't want I mean, if we use the conjugate prior in this case, all the weights would have similar magnitude. Whereas we might, for example, want a solution where we get a lot of zeros and a couple of very large values. And for that, we would need a different sort of prior. For example, one that is where the penalty is only linear in the deviation. And which would correspond to a Laplace distribution, for example, and which is not conjugate, so it makes the math harder, but we can still, at least, for example, maximum a posteriori inference in the model. Okay. Well, this was the data set that we looked at. And, well, I won't go over the other thing anymore, but we said, well, let's look at Gaussians to describe what we saw. And what we saw was kind of if we scrambled the data, our betas looked very Gaussian distributed. While if we didn't scramble the data, we got something that kind of looked like a Gaussian, but not quite. Right? It was a little bit like a very heavy-tailed Gaussian. And well, the argument was, okay, I mean, they probably some of them come actually from this scrambled distribution where the weight just fluctuates Gaussian around the mean, and some look different, where there's actually an effect that goes far away from that mean. So kind of these effects, they have different means for different snaps. And the reason why we said it's Gaussian is that we made this observation that, well, if we take sums of variables, and, well, the maximum likelihood estimate is a sum, then we observe something that is Gaussian. Now we come to the new part, where we say, okay, now let's look more at Gaussian. The first thing is just a very simple thing, is we just write down the product over independent Gaussians, right? So we have n random variables, each has a mean, each has a variance, and we have the product over these. And, well, this is just the formula for that. Well, if we just rework that a little bit, we can basically pull the product into the x, then we get a sum here. And we get the product over the variances here. And, well, now we introduce a matrix, which is a diagonal matrix, and it holds the variance of each point on the diagonal and has 0 otherwise. And we just put all the x's into a vector and all the means into a vector. Then we can write this as a multivariate Gaussian. So, so this is just a formula for a multivariate Gaussian. So the product over independent Gaussians is just a multivariate Gaussian where the covariance matrix is a diagonal matrix. It's the take-home message of the slide. It's a very simple one. So is it clear how we can do that? So we have here the product over sigma squared times to the power of -1/2. And it turns out that the determinant of a diagonal matrix is nothing more than the product of its entries. That is only true for a diagonal matrix. Because of that property, we can replace this product here by the determinant of this diagonal matrix. The other thing is that here the sum, the inverse of a diagonal matrix is again just, so you see we have here the sigma squared, 1 over sigma squared here, a sum over those. So the inverse of a diagonal matrix is just taking the diagonal part and writing 1 over it. So it's just inverting all of the entries of a diagonal matrix. Also, again, only true for a diagonal matrix. And for that reason, we can write the sum here as a squared form here. Everybody see the? I think it's not so hard. Well, the special case is if they are. So before we said they're independent. So independence applies that there's a product over the probabilities. That's the definition of independence. If they're also identically distributed with the same mean and the same variance, then we can write it differently. Then we have just the mean times a vector of ones, so which just means that each entry of the mean is mu, and the covariance becomes the identity matrix times the variance, which just means that all the entries are the same, and here and here. So this is now an IID Gaussian, just independent and identically distributed. So, well, to make our life a little bit easier, we don't have to, whenever we show something, repeat it for univariate and for multivariate Gaussian, because we know that the univariate Gaussian is a multivariate Gaussian. So we can just argue about multivariate Gaussians from now. Okay, so I showed this little experiment last time where we just threw dice n times and then asked what the distribution of the sum. Well, if we threw that dice once, we just observed the values of 1 to 6 at equal probabilities. And well, but if we threw a dice, for example, 5 times and repeated that throwing a dice 5 times, so and just basically we throw a dice 5 times, compute the sum, and do that many times, then if we plot a histogram over these values, we get something that looks like a Gaussian. So it seems to be true that if we throw dice many times and sum up the results, that if we do that, if we throw the dice often enough, then we get something that looks like a Gaussian. Now we'll do the same with, so that was a discrete example. Here we have something that is continuous, so we sample from a uniform distribution in the interval 0, 1 sometimes and compute the mean. What's the distribution of that? If we sample only once and note that value as the sum of the one thing and do that many times, then we get a uniform back. I mean, that's exactly what we've sampled from. But if we do that many times, for example, already for 2, we get a distribution that looks like that. If you do it already 10 times, then this looks very Gaussian. So there seems to be something between sums and Gaussians. And what is there? I mean, you probably already have heard about it. It's the central limit theorem. So we have, well, some x, which is a random variable, and it comes from some distribution, which we don't know the distribution, but we know that the mean is mu and the covariance is sigma. We don't know whether it's a Gaussian, it's something else, but it has a mean and a covariance. Now what we do is, well, we take n independent and identically distributed samples. So it's all, which that means is, well, just take n samples independently from each other, and they come all from the same distribution, from that, and that is p of x. Well, we note all of them, and now we compute the mean of those. So it's just call x bar of n the sample mean over those n trials. Now, we note, basically, we take the sample mean, subtract the mean of that distribution, and divide by the square root of n. So that's just some statistic that we now compute. And, well, it turns out that well, the distribution of this goes basically of this difference between the sample mean here and so this is the sample mean and this is the true mean, the expectation of the distribution, goes to 0 for large n. And well, the probability of well, just the statistics goes to a normal in distribution with zero mean and covariance equal to the covariance of sigma. So what does this imply? This implies if we don't subtract off the mean, then this has also square root of n times the mean here, right? I mean, oh, sorry. Should be, no, it goes to the mean. If we don't subtract off the mean, then we'll get the mean here. And the funny thing is that we started off with a variable that has an unknown distribution. It has whatever distribution. But as soon as we take averages, the only thing that matters, because we have a Gaussian, and a Gaussian is only parameterized by a mean and a covariance, is the mean and the covariance of the distribution. No matter what, like, I mean, the variable in the beginning might have an arbitrarily complicated distribution. If you take many samples from it and average those, all that matters becomes mean and covariance because we get a Gaussian. Everything else kind of washes out, it averages out.
Quick question, because I see the square root of n a lot. Why square root of n? Where does that come from?
Square root of, okay, so I can give you an intuitive answer. So I mean, they're independent samples, right? The variance of the sum of two independent samples is the sum of the variances, right? So the variance of the sum, if the two samples are independent, is the sum of the variances. So if I take the sum over the variables, I get 2 times the variance. If I take the sum over n, I get n times the variance as the variance. Now, in order to get something that has that variance, that's something that we'll see later. If we wanted, actually, it's something that is pretty clear. That has nothing to do with the Gaussian already. If we have a variable, the variance of a constant times that variable is that constant squared times the variance. Okay, so if we didn't have that square root of n here, then we would have here an n times sigma. Sorry. We have the sample average. So if we took only the sum, not the average, then we would have n times sigma. Now we have the sample average, which is 1 over n. So we have 1 over n squared times sigma, right? And if we take then, multiply that then with the square root of n squared, we get sigma. So the variance of where these are independent samples, so the variance of x n, that is something that we have. Now the covariance of the sum over x over n samples of that is n times the variance of x, right? Now we take the sample average. So if we have a 1 over n here, you have to divide by n squared here for the variance. So that's just a formula. So we're left with 1 over n. Now if we multiply by square root n, we get another n here, and this cancels out. Okay? Well, the funny thing is that thing becomes Gaussian if n is just large enough. We won't prove this because the proof is complicated, but it's a useful result because it tells us, well, if we have, probably you have a model and the model doesn't describe everything that's going on, right? We just have this, for example, linear function, and we use it to describe some process in reality that probably has a very, very complicated generative process. But if we ignore everything else and just take that linear function, then we could hope that all these other stuff, all the other things that are going on average, they don't matter, and they will just add up to something which we call Gaussian random noise. So that's why a Gaussian is a useful thing. It also means that a Gaussian is a limit distribution. Kind of, well, if you average, if you sum up many things, then become something Gaussian. Follows that if we sum up two Gaussians, this is also a Gaussian because we can view every one of those as the sum over many things that were non-Gaussian but became Gaussian. If you sum them together, we again have a sum over many things, twice as many things, well, even more so Gaussian. So the sum of two Gaussian will also be a Gaussian. So the Gaussian distribution is kind of closed under many operations like linear transformation, marginalization. So we will see that if you have a joint Gaussian distribution over some variables, then their marginal distribution will also be Gaussian, and conditioning. So if we have a Gaussian distribution over joint Gaussian distribution, multivariate Gaussian distribution over two variables, we condition on one, we get a Gaussian. Okay, so let's start with the linear transformation. So if you have, so this does now not need Gaussianity. So this is true for any expectation. So we have a random variable that has an expectation and a covariance. If we take a linear function in that expectation, so we just multiply it by some matrix because this is a multivariate variable, so it's a vector, the random variable, multiply it by some matrix, multiply it by a matrix, add a constant. Well, then the expectation just becomes a times the expectation plus b. So the expectation is also a linear function of the original expectation. If we want to write that out, it's very easy to see that if we take, so this is just plugging in the formula for the expectation, so it's the sum over all the realizations of x multiplied by their probability. Well, a times x plus b. We can, because a and b do not depend on p of x, we can just pull them out of the sum, right? Because we basically have now here we have b times p of x1, p of x, and so on, but they will sum up to 1, so we're just left with b. And on the other side, we can just pull out a out of the product. So that is just proving this linearity of expectation. For the covariance, well, we just do the same thing. So the covariance of a times x is a times the covariance of x times a transpose. Well, just do the same thing. We have the expectation of xx transpose. This is just, again, the definition of a covariance, which is the expectation of the square. So we have a xx transpose. Well, it's basically just the square for a vector is the outer product minus the square of the expectations. This b should go here. That's a typo. Well, again, we can do the same thing. We can write it at the, well, we have the expectation here. We know that the expectation is linear, so we just use the linearity of the expectation to pull out the A here and here. And well, there's an A and there's an A, sorry for that. So there are a couple of typos. So here and here we pull out the A, and then we're left with that. So that tells us if we know the mean and the covariance of a distribution of a random variable. If we take a linear transformation of that, we can also write down the mean and the covariance. And well, mean and covariances, knowing mean and covariances of variables is very useful if we're dealing with Gaussians, because Gaussians are only described by mean and the covariance. Yeah, now we can do a short pause.